So Juan-Andres Leon studied physics and history in Colombia before completing his PhD in the history of science at Harvard University. For the past 4 years, he's been living in Berlin while co-writing a book on the history of German astronomy and astrophysics in the second half of the 20th century. He works at the intersection between the physical sciences, political, and environmental issues. Parallel to his academic production, Juan-Andres has worked at several museums with an interest in modern scientific instrumentation and computing. He inquires on how knowledge is produced within large science organizations, such as the Max Planck Society, as well as international scientific initiatives, such as Atoms for Peace, CERN, and a multitude of astronomical observatories. All of these contributing insights regarding the ongoing globalization of scientific research and its role in the Anthropocene. So for Juan-Andres, we will have a sonic intervention with an image of a black hole.
In April 2019, people around the world marveled at the first photograph of a black hole, a fiery orange blur with a recognizable emptiness at its center, the shadow of the black hole itself. This image, which is quickly becoming amongst the most iconic products of modern science, also epitomizes the multidimensional complexities of modern science and its place in our globalized world. We are used to thinking of scientific images as photographs, which, intuitively we say, depict things as if one had been there to see them. Photography started in the 19th century as a process by which incoming light was focused on a surface covered with chemicals sensitive to light, darkening in proportion to the light they received. This is similar to the way the eye's retina captures an image, but made permanent and outside our head, verifiable by others. It was thought by many that photography could finally remove human subjectivity from the process of capturing how something in the world looked like. Photochemical surfaces replaced the camera lucidas and camera obscuras, in which a human's drawing hand did the work of the chemicals, but in the process also possibly retouched the world. Moreover, in the case of instruments working with very faint light, like telescopes and microscopes, a projecting surface was impossible, and there was no alternative to the human eye itself, connected to the artistic talent, but also the biases of a person depicting what they saw. The history of science is full of debates and controversies regarding the status of scientific images, those meant to depict how things really are out there in the world. Galileo himself learned very quickly that discussing with others what they saw through a telescope did not always lead to consensus. Rather, the process of seeing through instruments to produce what we today call science became attached to long learning processes and apprenticeships. In order to agree to what was seen through the scope, practitioners needed to exercise together, sort of calibrating each other's experiences to something that was collectively agreed on. But then, if we are also well attuned to each other and our observing tools, how do we avoid collective delusions? It soon became obvious that photography itself did not solve these problems, but rather added an additional layer to them. Issues such as framing and the soft boundaries between raw capture, processed image, enhancement, and fake. On top of all that, the most prominent 20th century thinkers recognized the inherent power relationships around who has the right to image and to be imaged. The issues just mentioned also influenced astronomy. There existed perhaps a brief moment from the late 19th century to the 1920s when the descriptive photograph dominated astronomical practice. A half-century in which photographic plates mounted on telescopes reproduced what the eye would have seen looking through it. But even then, our understanding of the cosmos had become less dependent on direct vision and its enhancement. Spectroscopy, for example, separated the colors of incoming light to decipher the chemical composition of celestial objects. Although still optical, this technique was quite detached from our intuitive sense of color. Meanwhile, Physicists had refined their theories into mathematical relationships, and by the 1920s, their picture of the cosmos was mathematically difficult, unintuitive, and abstract, given by quantum theory and Einstein's general relativity theory. The cosmos captured through a telescope was no longer something to visually contemplate or empirically analyze, but rather a battleground in a knowledge-making process moving back and forth between theory and observation, a place where theorized entities gained their status of real through some form of observational evidence, direct or indirect, and the value of surprises or serendipitous discoveries was determined by what they said about our current theories. For example, neutron stars, first proposed in the 1930s through nuclear quantum theory, were first seen in 1968 in the form of pulsars. Black holes, the subject of the picture we are discussing, existed as a mathematical exercise since the 19th century, were given a physical plausibility by Einstein's relativity, and were mathematically characterized only in the 1960s, while their actual existence remained contested. Regardless of theoretical doubts, however, the existence of what should be black holes was soon corroborated by new forms of observational but invisible astronomy, such as X-rays, detecting the powerful emissions that could only result by matter spiraling violently into an object so massive it had to be a black hole. From the had to be just described to the picture discussed here, it still took another half-century, culminating in April 2019. And curiously, this was a half-century during which, while increasingly relying on abstract theorizations and instrumentation that was further detached from the empirical act of seeing, much of the conceptual and technological abstraction was put in the service of reconstructing something akin to vision. We humans just don't seem to be able to imagine things other than, pardon the tautology, in images. The world needed a photograph of a black hole. But rather than photographing, since the end of World War II, the majority of telescopes record emissions electronically that would be invisible to us anyway, and the depictions of the cosmos that we see, when they are not straight artist depictions, are often composites of observations performed by multiple telescopes operating at different wavelengths, at different moments in time. Their colors are chosen for their scientific usefulness as sometimes as aesthetic considerations, not their fidelity to what a person would see while floating nearby. And still, the resulting images are admired as natural in the public imagination and that of many scientists themselves. Moreover, in the past decades, the resulting images are also the result of powerful computer calculations, transformations, simulations, and the outcome of what we now call artificial intelligence. The images that we see are only possible thanks to computers that have been programmed and apprenticed into our particular ways of seeing. The black hole image above is not something captured by a single telescope, but the composite calculational outcome of what is called an interferometric array. Multiple telescopes at different locations around the world observe the object simultaneously at the exact same wavelength. They captured millimeter microwaves emitted from the gas swirling violently around the center of a galaxy, a location that since the 1970s has been a strong candidate for a black hole. Its shadow was calculated to be large enough to be detectable interferometrically with telescopes placed on different continents of Earth. The choice of telescopes, techniques, and where to point in the sky are firmly embedded in unique scientific traditions, and even more selectivity comes through the process by which the signals recorded from each telescope are analyzed to yield a picture, an exhaustive mathematical technique called Fourier transforms, with its own long history extending to the early 19th century. But the group of telescopes provides only incomplete information, and the gaps are filled by inferences based on what is physically possible according to our theories, and the artificial intelligence equivalent of informed guesses. Finally, using fiery orange to represent the intensity of the emitted invisible microwaves was a purely aesthetic choice. This all to emphasize how culturally specific the process of obtaining this scientific photograph is, and how its conception and execution could only be thinkable within the established framework of the Western physical sciences. At the same time, astronomy, or more generally, the reading of the skies, has always been a practice driving globalization, ever since constellations guided many of the long-distance journeys that first populated the world with us humans, and later helping to put most of the world under the rule of Europeans and their descendants. During the 19th century, astronomy provided the theories and technologies of industrialization, coordinating our activities at increasingly short intervals of time and determining our locations ever more precisely. The geopolitical dominance of Europe was manifested in the networks of imperial astronomical observatories, and these observatories ultimately also collaborated with each other to consolidate the intellectual framework of Western hegemony within which science existed, answering from this perspective the deepest cosmic questions of their times. On top of all this, the image above is specifically the outcome of a newer stage of this difficult connection between astronomy and the imperial infrastructures that had made it possible over the centuries. The Blackhole photograph was only possible by bringing together observations from different continents. In each of these continents, very few locations allow the signals to be received, as they are absorbed by water vapor in the atmosphere. Very high and very dry mountains are needed. Since the middle of the 20th century, astronomical observatories have arrived at these extremely remote sites around the world. And while this expansion was occurring under a global political context of decolonization, their construction there was necessarily embedded in unequal power relations stemming from many centuries of European hegemony. The observatories that participate in this story, built and unbuilt, span the globe in places like Hawaii, Arizona, Chile, Namibia, Greenland, and Iraq, even the South Pole. European locations such as Spain have their own histories of intra-European scientific colonialism. The so-called Event Horizon Telescope, as it is and could have been, brings together a wide array of controversial histories of initial territorial appropriations through European imperialism, followed by local struggles for self-determination within so-called modernized states, which continue to exist under global unequal power, political and economic relationships. Only very slowly have observatories around the world attempted to integrate their local socio-political and cultural environments, rather than remain enclaves of elite metropolitan scientific projects. Ongoing democratization around the world means that often for the first time, these observatories need to justify themselves in their local context, to which they often initially arrived taking advantage of colonialist privileges. Several of these observatories initially disrespected the people living around them, and over the decades, the so-called non-Western people around them learned to formulate their claims within Western frameworks such as constitutional rights, religious freedom, or cultural pluralism, while debating internally how to deal with Western science. Is it a cultural practice commensurable with their own worldviews, or is it an instrument of Western hegemony? Is there room for coexistence and cross-fertilization, or is this accommodation inevitably a Trojan horse? These conflicts, however, reflected an increasing mercantilization of interculturalism itself. In both Arizona and Hawaii, the building and continued presence of these observatories is still a divisive issue among the surrounding native communities, pitting neighbors against neighbors and splitting them generationally, as people of different ages have experienced differently the struggle for their rights, either as citizens in modern democracies or as members of autonomous communities with distinct cultures. The mobilization of Western juridical instruments, such as financial compensation and community participation, inevitably westernized the rules of the game. The examples provided by the struggles of disadvantaged communities in the United States inevitably inspire similar movements elsewhere in the world, where scientific infrastructure are superimposed on post-colonial environments. To what degree is this not, perhaps, a new, more subtle form of cultural hegemonism? By 2019, the vast majority of the epistemic choices, inferences, and traditions that came together to produce the first photograph of a black hole are of solidly Western or Euro-descendant origins. And it was post-imperialistic conditions that made the construction of many of the participating observatories possible. Over the next generation, the crucial question to ask is how, through the ongoing democratization and globalization of science, such scientific images may begin to look different. How will the closer interaction between different ways of thinking from around the world and the closer embeddedness of astronomical practice within their local context lead to changes in the content of the science itself? Will most people in 50 years' time identify this image from 2019 as somehow true and objective, saying something about the cosmos out there? Or will many instead see it as the unfortunate product of an hegemonic system and worldviews? Are these two perspectives necessarily incompatible?
I think it was really important to articulate some thoughts about the scientific colonialism and how some of the scientific thoughts that we're given for granted are the result of some very violent power structures and the photo of the black hole from 2019 is the unfortunate product of an hegemonic structure that we are inhabiting. So